Hello, Politics and Media 101 listeners. John, it feels good to be back. We had a nice little break here for about a month and a half. We had our last episode on Thursday, and now this is our second one in a string that will be every Tuesday, Thursday now for a good while, holidays notwithstanding.
Yeah, Justin, it was good to be back, and it was also good to take a break, I think. We were talking about taking a little bit of break for August, and we were saying that it's what the French do every year. All the white-collar jobs, they take the whole month of work off. And that's kind of what we were trying to replicate. We took a little bit of a break in August, do a little traveling, watch a little sports, have a little breather. And now we're kind of coming back with what we're calling the third season of Politics and Media 101. We're actually on our third episode now because we've already released two. There was the one that we released at the beginning of our new September season on September 15th with Gerard DePippo, the former intelligence agent who gave us a rundown on our sanctions policy, especially as it applies to Russia. And then there was one that we released just yesterday or today as of this recording, which is on Thursday, with David Corn, his new book, American Psychosis. Justin, I know you really enjoyed that one because of your history with the GOP in the pre-Trump era, talking with David about how the GOP have and haven't evolved, the changes and the components of continuity over that time.
It can just be from my experiences, but I know that everything I was hearing, it sounded like a track on loop and a track on repeat. And David did a ton of research, and it was fascinating to hear you and him talk about the early amalgamation of not only the GOP, but the extreme wing of the GOP. I think you started out in like the 50s, and he gave this, I'd call it almost like a history lesson, right, John, where he was going back and reciting the evolution of the party and the extremisms in it. And it always came back to me to the extreme faction being race, the extreme faction being potentially religion, and then establishment, outsider, insider, that type of trope. So I enjoyed it thoroughly. And when it got to the Tea Party stuff, it was like, this is very good analysis from somebody that you maybe characterize as being a progressive. And normally progressives don't have that type of insight into the far right or of the party. And I enjoyed the discussion.
It's funny that you talk about whether progressives understand the GOP, because it reminds me of an observation during the Trump years. I think it might have been David Frum who said this, or someone similar. But the only people that really don't understand Trump and don't see him for what he is are his supporters, especially the kind of institutional Republicans who ended up apologizing for him all the time. People like Mick Mulvaney. These were the people who understood Trump the least. Trump's biggest opponents and critics, whether on the center left or the progressive left, understood Trump for exactly who he was. And they saw the Trump movement very clearly and accurately. And they were raising alarm bells ahead of January 6th. And the sort of conservative part of the center kept on saying, no, this can't happen. This can't happen. This can't happen. The progressives were right and the conservatives were wrong. Trump himself and his very close circle of advisors, the family members, the real toadies and lackeys, the Kash Patels and John McAtees, these people know who Trump is too. And they've always been honest about it. They've always said from the beginning, we're only in this for power and enrichment. I mean, they've been blatant about that. And they've always admitted openly what they're willing to do. They know who they are, and the progressives know who they are, and the center-left anti-Trump people who were characterized as Trump derangement syndrome. Trump derangement syndrome was accurate reading of Trump. It was the conservatives and the institutional GOP that kept on getting him wrong.
It's the anti-Trump folks, like you said, Mulvaney and
yeah. Mulvaney is a perfect example of the kind of person who did not see Trump for what he was.
He's doing it today. He literally did it today. He said that Trump was a victim of James in New York. But real quick story, and then maybe we should get into Trump. But a lot has happened, John.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about our summer travels yet, because I thought we were going to chat about that a little bit. I want to talk about going to Iceland and seeing a volcano.
You can brag about that in a little bit, but we have a perfect segue here. Maybe we'll just do a show where we talk about, some of the best travels we've had. But real quickly, Mulvaney, I think he's lying to himself, right? Like, he's not a dumb guy, like, by any means. But we were sitting in Tortilla because I don't know if I've told this story on air, and we were drinking, and it was, I think it was a fundraiser for my boss at the time, Tim Huelskamp. Mulvaney came over. His staff came over, and me and Mick Mulvaney, congressman at the time, got into a huge argument over Greg Hardy, who was an NFL player for the Panthers, North Carolina team, who really beat a woman senseless. It was a disgusting crime, and Mick Mulvaney was defending him, saying, my brother knows the owner Richardson, who later had to sell the Panthers because he was so racist. And Mr. Richardson's a very good guy. He lives by his word. If he says Mr. Hardy did nothing, he did nothing. Of course, a week later or something like that, pictures came out and it was terrible. But what Mick Mulvaney said was something that was extraordinarily smart and on the button. He goes, I believe that an institution takes the form of its leadership. So we can have institutions that have existed, but if you look at for hundreds of years, but if you look at the presidency, it takes the form of its leader. So if you have somebody immoral or corrupt, that's generally what the institution it embodies. And it's just very ironic that he would say that. And then we have the most immoral and corrupt president ever. And he's jumping, itching, just really dying to become the chief of staff of that cesspool that was the Trump White House.
Yeah, it makes me think of Louis XIV, right? L'État, c'est moi. I am the state.
Nope. Oh.
The long-serving king of France. Speaking of Louis XIV, Justin, Louis XIV was the longest-serving monarch in history, and the second longest-serving monarch in history has just died in the time that we've been away. And that was a story that certainly got a lot of headlines over our brief hiatus. I know that it wasn't of particular interest to you. And I mean, I understand and I do empathize with the recognition that, especially in recent decades, the British royal family have generally played a role more in the tabloid gossip media than they have in institutional politics. But it is still an interesting thing to think about because gives us an opportunity to kind of reflect on the long-term trajectory of the institution of her association, the British Empire and the Kingdom of England.
I'm going to have to defer to you, and I'll have some questions, John, but I just want to say I have sympathy for the folks in the UK that are saddened by her death. I obviously can't have empathy, but I'd like to say that she seemed like a very nice woman if you were a wealthy white person. So I think that you're alluding to the tabloids and those issues. But at the end of the day, what did it for me, and I do want to ask you a question about this, is we have the Queen's funeral. She's been dead for 2 weeks. It's all over the US news. We literally fought a war a few hundred years ago, so we didn't have to worry about this shit. And we have people in Puerto Rico dying. And instead of the United States media covering that wall to wall, flooding from a hurricane, we have the Queen gracing our television sets. So my question to you is, I am just a Republican through and through, not the party in the US, but the form of government. I'm an American citizen through and through, love baseball and apple pie. And to me, it's repugnant to see an institution where it's a bunch of wealthy people born into a position of privilege. They look down on practically everybody else. And then they have the state pay taxes. I think it's $500 million a year to fund their lavish lifestyles and all the mansions and castles and trips they take. And then they're treated like, you know, quasi gods with absolutely no power aside from the being born into this family. So what is the value for folks? And I'm not saying you're a monarchist, but what is the value of the monarchy?
I think it's funny that you said that she seems like a nice lady, because I remember talking to a colleague of mine when I was working on the channel over in the Emirates, who was a consultant from the UK media sector. And he was telling me about how the Queen was part of a category of people who were officially nice, who the media, as an understood a rule, always had to say was nice. And he told me that there was maybe 3 or 4 people in this category. And it was the Queen Mom, Gary Lineker, and Michael Palin. And I thought that was very funny. And if any of our listeners don't know who the latter people are, Gary Lineker is the host of Match of the Day football program on BBC. He was also a footballer for Leicester. And Michael Palin's one of the Monty Pythons, and he's always the kind of the nice guy Python. Although he played memorably against type in the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam. But what role does the monarch play in Britain today?
How do they get $500 million in taxes?
Yeah, so I'm not a monarchist myself. I lived in a monarchy for a long time, and the monarchy that I lived in was an absolute monarchy where the monarch had real institutional power, autocratic power. In the UK, it's not really like that, as we understand. Since the early modern period, it's been the king in parliament. It's been real parliamentary sovereignty, and the king is kind of serving at their pleasure. And there were lots of incidents in history in which, the relative power between the parliament and the king was controversial. Kings were executed by parliament. Famously, Charles I is the namesake, perhaps, of our new sovereign there. Why does the monarchy even still exist at all if it's the king and parliament and parliamentary sovereignty and not really much institutional power over government? What they will tell you, the real monarchists who really support the institution, is that it is a sense of continuity of regime. The UK are now one of the oldest regimes in the world, just like us. Most, regimes, most, government systems that exist in the world are so much newer. Even in Europe, even in Western Europe. Think about France. They're only in the Fifth Republic since the time of Charles de Gaulle. The UK system has gone on for so long because of this continuity, and because of this commitment to the system as it is. They believe that having this continuous role for this royal person, a royal family, gives it legitimacy. Britain have a unwritten constitution. It's all based on the commitment of all the people in government to the system. And the monarch is part of that system, and a role that's continuing evolving like the rest of their constitution, but a role that still exists. And there's this piece of political science, I wish I remember the author, but he was talking about the different sources of legitimacy. And he said that, there's rational legal legitimacy, which is kind of the way the US regime is considered legitimate, which you've got a system that is conceived through principles and through lawyerly logic and has credibility because it makes sense. And then you've got the charismatic legitimacy, and this is, kind of the despot legitimacy, legitimacy of someone like Napoleon or Stalin, someone who is in charge because the people follow him as he raises the banner. And then the third category that this gentleman identified was the traditional legitimacy, that the idea that a regime is legitimate because it's been around for so long and it's just become the status quo that everyone agrees with. And that's sort of where we are with the UK and their monarchy. And something else that I want to point out here is that monarchies are actually quite common in Western Europe. We think of Western Europe as the progressive part of the continent, but this is where monarchy survives. There's no monarchies in Central and Eastern Europe at all. All the big monarchies of Central and Eastern Europe were dissolved after the First World War. The German Empire, the Kaiserreich. There was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there's the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, and they all dissolved right at the same time. But because the Western countries won the war, generally their monarchies have survived. There's actually 6 kings right now in Western Europe. You've got all 3 Scandinavian countries are kings, or rather are monarchies, because there's a queen in Denmark, Queen Margrethe. Then Belgium and Netherlands, they both have kings. Spain has a king, and Britain have a king. So you've got 6. You've also got the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. You've got the Prince of Liechtenstein and the co-princes of Andorra. And you've got the Pope. So you've got monarchies all over. Oh, and I didn't even mention Monaco. You've got monarchies all over Western Europe. It's only the British royal family get this insane amount of tabloid attention. You don't hear about King Harold of Norway in a supermarket tabloid. But let's not forget that there's actually a lot more monarchies than we realize, and they're all in the part of Europe that everyone in America thinks of as being the advanced and progressive part.
I listen to you and you're making me sick to my stomach. I'm just thinking of all this government waste.
And there's been scandals with these other royal families, like in Spain. Yeah.
Spain. Yeah.
And I think there's been some in Netherlands and Belgium as well that I don't know the story quite as well, but
I guess the mythos that I was brought up on, and it's different for everybody, right? So I'm not disparaging our brothers and sisters in these monarchies. The mythos I was brought up on is this telling of the American story, which revolves around personal freedom, no taxation without representation. It's literally throwing off the shackles of a monarchy. So don't
forget though that those liberal principles, right, were developed in Britain
Britain and France.
Yeah, a bit. Yeah. I think that the Bill of Rights in England, though, does predate the French Bill of Rights by quite a long time.
Yeah, it does. It does. But Montesquieu would wrap up the Bill of Rights, and that was his favorite, one of his cardinal documents that he would point to. And then there were other versions of personal liberty that he would point to in France.
It is contradictory. It's a paradoxical that these places, just like we've been saying, that we associate with individual liberties and the Enlightenment more so than some of their neighbors, have kept the monarchies around. Not in France, but in most Western countries.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to talk about with you is, so I'm going to show my ignorance here because monarchy abhors me. I don't think about it. I don't research it unless, Donald Trump is wearing a ridiculous suit to see the Queen and the Queen is like showing a look of disgust on her face. But when we were talking about this, I didn't realize that there are countries around, it just didn't come to me that there are countries around the world that still recognize the Queen of England
as their head of state.
So there's Canada and Australia.
Yeah.
Then the Caribbean nations, Jamaica, you can rattle them off. So this Queen seemed rather well respected, if not well liked, around the world in these territories. Do we think that her passing will have any influence in getting rid of the monarchy in some of these territories or nations?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that it's almost a fait accompli that there's going to be more republics in the Caribbean. And I don't know whether this is a well-known news story among our listenership, but in 2021, just last year, while Queen Elizabeth II was still living, Barbados became a republic, a country that had Queen Elizabeth as their head of state. So I'd been saying for years before that I thought that some of these Caribbean countries might be the first ones to leap, but I didn't expect that it would happen until after the succession, because Queen Elizabeth has been the only head of state that many of these Caribbean countries have ever had in their independent history. The interesting thing about Queen Elizabeth that's been remarked a lot in the coverage after her death was that she's the bridge between the era of the active British Empire, in many cases, and decolonization and the independence of many of these English-speaking countries around the world. The biggest countries that were part of the British Empire in South Asia, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, they became, well, not Bangladesh, until 1971. They all became independent of the monarchy and the British Empire in the late 1940s. So she wasn't the head of state at that time. But these countries in the Caribbean and in much of Africa, they were decolonized later. So the entire independent history of many, many countries that were part of the British Empire has been while she was queen. And these countries, none of the countries in Africa chose to keep her as the monarch, but many of these countries in the Western Hemisphere did. So she's been part of their history. Jamaica have never had another head of state, ever. She's the only head of state that Jamaica have ever had. So I was expecting that these countries, in order to pursue decolonization further to its fullest extent, would become republics after her death and the succession of her son. But Barbados did so while she was still living. And I think that that's such a strong indication of where the region might be heading. There's politicians in several countries in the Caribbean that are advocating for this openly. So I think we'll be seeing this relatively near term. Maybe for some of our American listeners, the more interesting question, and for many people, the more difficult question is, what's going to happen to these very large settler countries that speak English like Australia and Canada, whether they will abandon the monarchy, because they still recognize the Queen as their head of state. They still print her, well, now the king, but they still print their faces on all of their currency. And they have these positions in their governments, the governor general, the representative of the monarchy, who has real constitutional power in those countries. In Australia, and I think it was the 1980s, he dissolved parliament, the governor general. He has the power to do that. The representative of the Queen told all the parliament to pack up and go home in the 1970s or 80s. This is power that they have. So what are these countries going to do? There's been polling in Canada that shows that the monarchy is not very popular.
I just need to stop you right there. So you're telling me that the currency in Canada and Australia and all over the UK is going to change to this old septuagenarian who has done nothing but suck off the teat of the state for his whole career and life. He hasn't had a career. And that's going to be the face on all these notes, when on the US note, it's George Washington for the 1, Abraham Lincoln, independence, Abraham Lincoln ending slavery on the 5. You got President Grant on the $50 bill. You got Benjamin Franklin, the Continental Congress, on the $100 bill. I take our notes any day over King Charles.
Yeah, I mean, you might take one of their notes.
Sorry.
You might take one of their notes just because it's valued a little bit higher, although it's trending downwards and ours is trending upwards. We're at parity with the euro now, I think. In Canada, they're printing the face of their head of state on their currency. And I think more and more Canadians are realizing how absurd this is. Maybe they've kind of internalized it and forgotten about it because it is so distant. Maybe less so when the Governor General is dissolving your parliament, but on a day-to-day basis, it's rather distant. Now that they're seeing all of this coverage in the news and being reminded that their head of state was this woman across the water, I think perhaps more of them are starting to wonder if it's really worth keeping around. In Canada, there was a recent poll of whether the public support the institution of the monarchy, and most people said no. It's quite different from the UK. And I thought the partisan breakdown was very interesting because the party that supported the monarchy the most, I was expecting it to be the Conservative Party of Canada. It's actually the Liberal Party, the Justin Trudeau's party, which is kind of the centrist party in Canada. They were the most supportive of the monarchy.
He's a member of a dynasty, so maybe that makes some sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Dynastic politics. Then the Conservatives a little bit less than that. The Progressives, the NDP party in Canada, much less than that. But then the Bloc, Le Bloc Québécois, the Quebec Nationalist Party, it's like the King's approval rating there is like minus 90. They're ready to go all Oliver Cromwell against the guy.
That is funny. And we will definitely look to that and look to you and other guests to explain what's happening as changes begin to happen. But I do want to move over to the wannabe monarch in the United States, Mr. Donald Trump. So since we've been on, there's been a lot that's happened. Take away the political January 6th committee and let's look at real legal issues. So John, help me out here, but essentially former President Trump, I don't know, stole classified documents and government documents from the White House.
Yes. I think that's the right word to use.
So help me retell this as I go through. Let me know if I'm making any mistakes. So he leaves the White House. He steals these documents. Apparently 100 of them, at least, were very highly classified. And he keeps them for 18 months. And during this time period, the National Archives, who are supposed to have some of these documents at least, or get the government papers back. I don't know if the classified ones should have ever left the SCIF or a secure location. He ultimately stonewalls them for like a year, and then he gives some of them back. And then the FBI asks him, do you have any more documents? And his lawyers lie to the FBI, saying, no, they were all given back. Everything that remains is Trump's property. And then we ultimately end up with a search of Mar-a-Lago by the FBI. And it leaks out from the Washington Post has sources that some of these documents pertain to the nuclear capacity of a different country in the world. Is that fair of where we're looking?
Yeah, that's more or less, it's a fairly complete accounting of a story there. I mean, the documents that he was storing there at his private residence in Florida included documents regarding something called special access programs, which is pretty much the highest level of sensitivity in the U.S. government system. They also are reported to have included information from human sources. So these are essentially spies, people overseas from other nationalities who are providing information to U.S. intelligence agencies. And there had been a memo circulating in the U.S. government around this time, noting that a remarkably high number of foreign human sources were dying, were being killed. And there has been some speculation of a connection between his improper holding and access to this information and that incident. But we don't know so much about that just yet. But it does at least demonstrate why the DOJ National Security Division was so interested in getting these materials back and figuring out why he was holding them and his purpose in holding them. In order to conduct this search of the residence in Florida, of course, the Department of Justice, including the FBI, had to get a search warrant approved. And in order to do so, they had to present evidence to a judge that there was probable cause that a federal crime had been committed. And they did so, and the judge was satisfied that probable cause existed. It seems like the former president lied to the agents of the DOJ about what he was holding and where, and was concealing some of these documents that had been illegally kept and stored by him. So one of the statutes that they listed on the search warrant, because they have to list the statutes of the crimes that they're saying there's probable cause may have been committed, was the Espionage Act, which is a statute that's been used to prosecute people who have stolen information and sometimes circulated it, people like Manning. And so you can kind of understand how this criminal case is being constructed.
Yeah, and President Trump, he goes ballistic. He starts attacking the FBI. He starts attacking the DOJ. He gets up at his rallies, and it's, the normal stuff. You have Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity. You have a whole cadre of MAGA former Tea Partiers going out there defending him, attacking the rule of law. But what was interesting is there's some legal maneuvering where Trump's lawyers brought a motion in front of Judge Cannon. And I'm not truly up to date on all the legal machinations, but ultimately she ruled in favor of President Trump's legal team, and she stopped the damage assessment that was being done by, I believe, one of the national security agencies. She basically told the FBI, we got to wait till we appoint a special master to go through these documents. John, so could you walk us through what has happened since Judge Cannon's ruling with some of the special master and then also the recent appellate ruling?
Yeah, so I think something that people should understand as they try to follow along this narrative is about the evidence review process. So after a search warrant is executed, then the government is in possession of all of this evidence. And there is always a risk that as the government are accessing this evidence, they will inadvertently come across privileged information that they shouldn't have access to. So the DOJ have a process for this about separating the privileged information, and it's done through something called a taint team. So the taint team, there's like a Chinese wall between them and the agents that are involved in this search and in building the case. They're a team of people who are dedicated to doing a first review of the evidence and taking out the evidence that might be privileged. And generally, attorney-client privilege would be some of the most common information that they would be separating in this process, right? So there is a process in place for this review to happen by the taint team. The taint team, it's a very strict process. Every single thing that they touch is recorded. Every keystroke on their keyboard as they're accessing digital documents and recording documents is all recorded to make sure that they're picking out all the things that they need to, and that the agents involved in building the case don't have access to anything that they're not supposed to have. This is the way that it generally works. In a situation where the DOJ really can't be trusted at all to be doing this properly, if there's some extraordinary circumstance, then the plaintiff can appeal to get a special master to conduct this review in addition to or instead of the taint team, a third party, someone who's not even part of the DOJ. The fact that this was requested in this situation was so strange because this information was so heavily classified that you would not want a third party to be looking at it, usually. And also because the Trump team couldn't demonstrate that there were any extraordinary or unusual circumstances or that there'd been any misconduct on the part of the DOJ, that the DOJ processes were somehow inefficient, that a plain review of the situation would not have resulted in this third party special master being appointed. What was even beyond that was that the Trump team were saying that they wanted the special master not only to review for attorney-client privilege information, but also for executive privileged information. The reason this is so bizarre is because Trump is not the executive and the DOJ are the executive. So the idea that he would have executive privilege information that the DOJ couldn't access is completely upside down world. But the judge sided with the Trump people, appointed a special master, Judge Deary. And when this all went over to him, he said, "What are we doing here? Like, why am I here? Why are you here? Why are we doing any of this? None of this makes sense." The strange thing is the Trump team actually requested that this gentleman be appointed special master. They thought that he was going to be sympathetic to them because he was the gentleman who signed the FISA warrant to surveil Carter Page. We're getting a little bit complicated here.
It sounds like we're getting a little bit conspiratorial on the end of the Trump lawyers too.
Well, I mean, this was reported by Axios, but their theory was, we're getting a little complex. I don't know how many people remember all of these narratives, but we're going back a little bit too.
Your area of passion is truly coming out. All of this Trump legal minutia.
The Trump campaign had not a legal advisor. They had a foreign policy advisor named Carter Page, who was someone who had been pursuing a lot of commercial deals in Russia and had been under investigation as a potential foreign agent for on and off for a while.
Multiple times.
Yeah. And so when Trump was claiming this guy was on his team, the DOJ wanted to look into him again. And they asked a FISA court, which is a court that gives warrants for the government to surveil people as intelligence targets. They applied to get a FISA warrant on Carter Page at this FISA court. And it was found later on by the Office of Inspector General that they had mishandled the warrant application. They'd altered some evidence. There was an FBI lawyer named Kevin Kleinsmith who altered an email that was included in the evidence, and he was later prosecuted for doing this. And also they included information from the Christopher Steele memos without providing enough disclosure about the source. I think that they included in the warrant some caveats and said this is a campaign-connected source, but the OIG thought that they should have done it more explicitly. So the judge who received this warrant and approved it was Judge Deary. And so the Trump people thought when they were asking for a special master, maybe Judge Deary will be on our side because he might feel like he got burned by the FBI and misled by them in this instance in the past. So maybe he has a grudge against them for misleading the FISA court himself, and he'll be sympathetic to our argument that DOJ are acting improperly in this search. But, their attempt to read his mind had a rude awakening as soon as the first hearings with him as special master started being conducted. And it became clear that he was not impressed by their rather nonsensical conspiratorial arguments. I'm afraid that their ploy of appointing him is not necessarily working on their favor in anything other than delaying and disrupting the whole process.
Yeah, so that has backfired. And then for poor Judge Cannon, who has been pilloried in the news by progressives like former Attorney General Bill Barr, and I use progressive as a joke, but also moderates, conservatives, liberals, and actual progressives, some folks on MSNBC. Apparently, recently, I think it was yesterday, an appellate court of two Trump appointed judges, apologies, and one appointed by President Obama came out, John, with basically a thorough rebuke of most of what she was saying. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so she had basically put a pause on the entire investigation while everyone had to wait for the special master to do this review. And she said the special master should be reviewing everything, that he should be reviewing for executive privilege, that the DOJ can't have access to any of the documents. She said that she thought that the National Security Damage Assessment Review could continue, but there was no real way to do that if they didn't have access to the documents. So it was a bit confused and a bit of a mess. So she's the district court. DOJ appealed her ruling to the circuit court. This is the 11th Circuit, which is oversees pretty much the southeast of the country. It's like Florida, Georgia, a couple other states. There's a panel of 3 judges that were selected from the circuit court. And just like you said, it was 2 Trump appointees and Obama appointee. And they had a unanimous ruling putting a stay on parts of her order. They said that they were going to carve out these highly sensitive national security documents from the review. This is how I understand their ruling. Pardon me if I'm making any mistakes or anything like that. But as I understand it, I think it was about 100 documents that the DOJ said, even if the special master is going to continue, we want to just carve out these pieces so we can do the damage assessment. And the 11th Circuit said, please, yes, we're going to carve these out. And in their ruling, they made a complete mockery of the processes and rationales of Judge Cannon. And I remember, Justin, off microphone here, you were asking me, is there any penalty or punishment for a judge that makes a really egregious ruling? And I said that as far as I'm aware, what you'll get is just being really embarrassed when it gets overturned on appeal. And that's pretty much what happened. I mean, it's very professionally embarrassing for Judge Cannon that the 11th Circuit eviscerated her in the way that they did. And I'm sure that, especially as a young judge, it's a reputational burden that she would prefer not to be carrying for the rest of her career as a lifetime appointee.
Well, you never know. Maybe somebody like Ron DeSantis will view it as a positive and appoint her to the Supreme Court.
I will point out that it is possible for judges to be impeached. There is actually a process for removing judges. That would actually happen through the U.S. Congress because they're federal appointees.
So I do want to just point out one argument that Judge Cannon had basically gave credence to was that prosecuting Trump would injure him to the point where it would be too much harm to the former president. And in the appellate court ruling, there's this great quote, and I'm going to read it verbatim here. Second, we find unpersuasive plaintiff's insistence that he would be harmed by criminal investigation. Here's the quote. Bearing the discomfiture and cost of a prosecution for crime, even by an innocent person, is one of the painful obligations of citizenship. And it's beautiful for whoever came up with this because the court case that they are quoting is Cobbledick versus the United States of America. So there's some poetic justice in what they're saying there. But
it sounds a bit Dickensian, I think.
But at the end of the day, John, it was a thorough rebuke. It was embarrassing. And it really has, put the ball back in the DOJ's court, and the rule of law has somewhat been restored. And as a result, you had President Trump go on the intrepid reporter show, Sean Hannity, and he was discussing this case. And there's a view in journalism that the most difficult interviews for folks are not the ones that are hard hitting because you have your guard up, but it's actually the ones where you go on friendly shows. And on this show, former President Trump told Sean Hannity that he could declassify documents just by thinking about it. So basically telepathically that he could declassify these documents. And you had a few senators, a few very prominent senators from the GOP asked about these comments. And I think that this is one of the few times that these members of the U.S. Senate went against Trump in anything related to impeachment trials or legal cases. And it's pretty stunning and I think pretty noteworthy. You had the minority whip, John Thune, you had Mike Rounds, and you had Tom Tillis, 3 respected GOP senators. They were all asked about it, and they basically said, no, you can't just do it by thinking about it. There's a process that even the president must follow to declassify these documents. So that is all to say, Judge Cannon was thoroughly rebuked. Not only that, President Trump suffered a couple of legal losses with the appointment of a special master that's sympathetic to the truth and the FBI and the DOJ, but also now politically, it's beginning to maybe potentially turn a little bit against President Trump. And I think that that's something to note.
It's funny you outlined the senators that had been issuing this critique. And it's funny because it was always a bit of a parlor game during the Trump years to think about which senators kept on going off the record and saying negative things about Trump in restaurants and back rooms to journalists. And the three that you named are certainly in that company, right? I mean, Thune, Rounds, and Tillis, right? I mean, these are certainly people who we would expect to be in that category. But I want to say something about this idea that the president could declassify something without telling anybody. And this is so preposterous and ridiculous, even on its face, because it contradicts the entire concept of the classification system. What does it even mean for something to be classified? Why do we have a classification system? The classification system are guidelines for how federal employees are meant to access and use documents. That's what classification means. It's guidelines for how me, if I was a bureaucrat, what I can see, what I can't see, how I have to store something. This is not a workable system at all. The system doesn't even exist if the employees, the federal employees, can't tell if something's classified or not. It's a labeling system. It's a classification system. It only exists if there are clear labels about what's classified and what's not. So if any document might be declassified without it being declared to be so or labeled as being so, then how on earth can I know as a federal employee what's classified and what's not? There's no way to know. If the president can telepathically declassify something, then when I've got a document in front of me, how do I know what its status is? So it's just not workable. Like there's no such thing as classification if classification operates that way. It can be dismissed immediately.
And it's a serious thing, right? It's to protect national security and protect basically the citizens of the United States and our interests. One thing that I found funny, and it's, we shouldn't be making light of this, but if former President Trump could telepathically declassify documents when he was president, couldn't President Joe Biden telepathically reclassify those the day that he got into office?
Sure. The law is non-retroactive, so it would depend on the time in which they got classified or reclassified. But the thing is that if you can just retroactively claim classification, then sure enough, the new president can do exactly the same thing.
On the day he got into office, on January 20th.
Yeah. One thing that I think that President Biden is doing correctly is maintaining a completely separate operation and decision-making and circle of discussion from the DOJ.
He's not talking about it.
And this is something that we haven't seen probably since Janet Reno was the AG under Bill Clinton, like a real clear separation between what was going on at the Justice Department, what was going on in the White House. And this was manifested in different ways in the time since. But certainly George W. Bush was quite close with John Ashcroft and with Al Gonzalez, and leading to some scandals.
You and I both were at the same intern talk where Eric Holder told us, I believe it was in 2012. We didn't know each other.
Yeah, we were in the same room at the time. I asked Eric Holder about Iraq. Yeah.
And Eric Holder told us that he was Barack Obama's best friend.
Yeah. Yeah, they had a quite close relationship. I'm not sure if it was quite so close with his successor at DOJ, who was Loretta Lynch.
But remember the Fast and the Furious, where the White House was supporting Holder?
Sure. What I was going to say, though, about Lynch was even if she was not quite as close with Obama as Holder was, she did get in trouble for having a meeting with Bill Clinton when there was a DOJ matter involving Hillary Clinton.
You don't have to remind this former RNC operative. We were like, oh, baby, Christmas is coming early. I remember it. Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch, they had planes on the same tarmac. And Bill Clinton had the balls to go into Loretta Lynch's plane during the investigation to potentially talk about it. Even if they didn't talk about it, what type of image is that? And we were just like, hallelujah, praise be to him.
It was absolutely and completely inappropriate, and it correctly backfired very much on Bill Clinton. I will say, of course, that their successors, the Trump people, had no compunction whatsoever, just publicly interfering and pressuring DOJ to act in criminal investigations according to their political wishes. Jeff Berman, also the former U.S. attorney in Southern District of New York, he just published a whole book about this, relaying some of the episodes that he did talk about at the time publicly, like and Health Bank and everything. But then also some that we didn't even really know about that weren't really on our radar, like that the political appointees had pressured, and he was a political appointee himself, I should say, but that the White House had basically been demanding that DOJ prosecute Greg Craig and investigate John Kerry. But yeah, we had this problem with the close relationship or the interfering relationship between the White House and the DOJ under Trump, more probably than even any of these other problematic examples.
I didn't know it was going to be possible for them to make me feel bad for Jeff Sessions.
Yeah.
But the way that they treated that man.
Yeah. And then William Barr. And then after Barr resigned for the final 2 months of the presidency, it was even, that was as bad as we've really ever seen it. Yeah. But I think that Biden, they're doing a very good job of keeping those two realms very separate, which is appropriate. And I think that it's a way of, building trust that there's a fair process. And that's part of the personnel decisions that they made too. I mean, there's not a close personal relationship, I don't think, between General Garland and Biden. Not much idea of them having a previous professional relationship. And Garland is someone who, even though he was a SCOTUS nominee, it doesn't have a particularly political profile and long time career in the Justice Department and then the judiciary. So I remember, Justin, you were criticizing some of the initial communications from the DOJ about the search warrant, but I don't know if you've revised your assessment in the time since.
No, I still don't think there should be leaking anything to anybody about anything related to this.
What leaks did you suspect or witness?
Wow, I didn't witness anything, John.
What I mean is, by reading an article that includes leaks, you are witnessing.
Okay, that is fair. By reading an article and liberally reading between the lines, I just, the way that a lot of this information has been presented, I believe that the contents of the documents that we've learned about, so there was an initial leak that they thought Trump could have nuclear secrets, and that was one of the justifications for the warrant. And then after they got the documents and reviewed the documents, it came out, and Trump then attacked the DOJ and FBI directly. It came out that, again, it was nuclear documents for some other country. And there's speculation running rampant about what that country is. Is it North Korea? Is it Israel? Is it another country? It's just the timing of the leaks, the authors of those stories, who I'm not going to call out, and their background, and the way that the stories were constructed. It just led me to believe that this was likely a DOJ leak. And then in addition to that, you got to remember, previously, we've had leaks out of the White House about how the White House hasn't been happy with Merrick Garland and what he's been doing. So the ship has sprung a few leaks. It isn't like, the Trump White House where the damn thing was at the bottom of the ocean after year one because of how leaky it was. But I just don't think that we should be hearing anything about the nature of these documents until the DOJ wants us to.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that in the time before the search warrant was executed, there was no public reporting about the existence of this investigation at all. And that is in contrast to a number of other high-profile investigations with political ramifications, right? Because many of these are started for very legitimate, credible reasons. They just have political implications in their consequences. In the time in advance of the search warrant, there was nothing in the media that even hinted at the existence of this investigation. And I will also say that some of the eye-catching details about the documents, such as they exist in the limited details that we have, actually did not come from leaks, but came from disclosures and court documents. One of the items that caught a lot of people's eyes was that there was a document recovered in the search warrant execution involving the president of France. It was like a intelligence report on the president of France. And I believe that became publicly known because of the court document that disclosed some of the contents of the evidence. It wasn't from a media leak. It was just in the legal process that became publicly known. So I think that sometimes these things do get a bit conflated. But I will say, I will grant you that, I remember the article you're talking about that said that
both of them. It was right after the warrant and then a little bit later, right?
Yeah, I think that they perhaps were responding to the very, very, very aggressive communications and media that was coming from the Trump side at that time. And I do also recall the comments that were, I think we can say, leaked by the Biden White House that he was hoping that Merrick Garland would do more. And I certainly agree with you that that was inappropriate. And just like I was saying, I was complimenting him a minute ago for generally keeping DOJ separate from the politics and the White House. And that's an exception. And it's an unfortunate exception to that general pattern.
And I'll play devil's advocate quickly here. The DOJ, first off, I think they've done great. And I agree with you, everything that you said, generally speaking. But to play devil's advocate, the leaks in themselves were proportional because Trump was basically gaslighting the whole American public. And in doing so, he was getting basically all of the Republicans on his side to attack the DOJ. And in doing so, undermine the rule of law. They do the first leak. It pumps the brakes a little bit, like a little quick pump brake, a little push of a shock. And then he keeps at it. And then they give him a left hook to the face, like, back off. This is serious shit. This is nuclear. And then it got members of Congress to like stop. And even the Republicans, not the crazies, but the more morally upstanding ones, to be like, okay, we need to wait a little bit and wait and see. And now you have those three members of the Senate that we said completely turn and do a 180. So there is a devil's advocate there. I just think that at the end of the day, nobody's going to be perfect. And I think that the way that we improve our government is to call them out and not be partisan hacks. Not that you are, not that I am either. It's just most people aren't calling them out for that because most people, they're the sources for these reporters.
No, I mean, I think that your criticism of the comment from Biden's White House that got into the media that he wanted Garland to be more aggressive, I think that that's absolutely a well-founded criticism, and I share it. I think you're absolutely right to criticize it.